So we're going to start with a somewhat longer passage of Scripture, and it's something we looked at somewhat last week. We didn't cover everything. And again, because this is a very, very long and involved passage, we're not going to cover everything about it tonight. But I felt we didn't do it enough. We didn't do it enough justice last week, so I wanted to come and revisit this. So in Daniel chapter 4, we'll begin reading at verse 19. And we'll go through verse 27, and then we'll talk about what it says. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while. Now this is after he gets the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Okay, so that's what's going on. And his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in which was found food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of the heavens lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to the heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. So I want to talk about one thing as we begin, and then we'll get into a different subject in a moment here. But I had never thought about this, but as I was doing research here, I was reading several different commentaries and things that different scholars had written, Christian scholars. And one of the things that surprised people is the way that Daniel was troubled by what the dream meant. That's in the beginning of verse 19. Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed. And that's the old equivalent of saying his face was downcast. Remember the old King James Bible? He was made sad, right? He was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. And people were surprised by that because Daniel knew that Nebuchadnezzar was not a good person. He was not a jolly old king and just a great guy at heart. He was proud, arrogant, domineering, was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, could be very, very cruel. And yet Daniel obviously cares about this king. Not a good man, but Daniel cares about him and doesn't want to see him suffer in the way that the dream is indicating here. That's why he's troubled. He's upset by it. And so on the one hand, Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel knows this, does not deserve God's mercy, right? Not a good person. And well, nobody deserves God's mercy, but he really doesn't deserve God's mercy. And yet Daniel is still hoping that God will do this. May this dream be for those who hate you. And that's what he says there in verse 19. My Lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. And I'm thinking about this. Why would Daniel care for this king? And I think it was simply because, and I'm speculating here. I could be wrong about this. But I think it was because Daniel was somebody who prayed a lot. And if you pray a lot, it's going to have an effect on you. It's going to change how you think. It's going to change how you view things. Because remember, Nebuchadnezzar was the person who was responsible, number one, for the destruction of Daniel's nation. He was the one that invaded Judah and basically laid it to waste. And he's responsible for the captivity of the Jewish people who are now living more, for the largest part in Babylon. And so if anything was going to come along and do harm to Nebuchadnezzar, by normal human standards, Daniel should have been happy. Like, yeah, he's getting what he deserves. But he wasn't. He wasn't happy about it. And again, I think, and maybe you have a different theory about this, I'll be interested in hearing it, but I think it was because, in large part, because Daniel spent so much time in prayer, and it changed his way of looking at things, and he was able to look beyond what Nebuchadnezzar deserved, humanly speaking, and instead he was able to see what Nebuchadnezzar actually needed, what he needed, which was mercy. So that's just kind of to introduce it tonight. I thought that was an interesting thing to bring up. And so now let's go on to the dream itself. And what you see is Daniel being very committed to telling the truth. And he gives it to Nebuchadnezzar exactly what it means without holding anything back. And the message, we already read it, was this, that Nebuchadnezzar represented, that beautiful tree represented Nebuchadnezzar. But that also meant that he was the one who was going to get humbled by God. That tree was going to get chopped down, right, for the most part. And then the way he's going to get humbled, the way the tree gets chopped down, is going to be even more dramatic. He's going to be driven out of society because he becomes unfit to live among people. And he's going to live out in the fields like an animal. That's in verse 25. You shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling place shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. Now, I looked something up, and I didn't put in your notes because there was a kind of mixed opinions. Can a person live on grass? Some people said it's possible, but it's not ideal. But, it is possible. So, and we don't know if it was just grass Nebuchadnezzar was going to eat, if there was other edible foodstuffs, but yeah, who knows, right? But yeah, that was an interesting question. Maybe we might get into that a little more in the next few weeks. But so here's Daniel, and he's telling this to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, what do you think about what kind of courage that took? Because we just looked at a story a few weeks ago of Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they do something that displeases this king. And what does he do? He stokes a furnace to 7 times its original temperature, and then has them tossed in. So this is not a guy you want to offend. And here's Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar something he probably didn't want to hear, but Daniel's going to tell the truth because he's trusting God. And so he tells him exactly what's going to happen, and he makes it very clear to him that the reason this is going to happen is because God is judging him, God's judging Nebuchadnezzar, for his refusal to humble himself. And that's in the middle of verse 25. 7 periods of time shall pass over you till you know that the Most High, that's a reference to God, of course, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And so that statement there, right in the middle of this entire passage, that zooms in on, hones in on Nebuchadnezzar's essential problem. This is the core of his issue. He's the king of the most powerful nation on earth, right? He's the guy that has the say-so in whatever he wants to have the say-so. And so he, understandably, believes that authority and control rest in his hands. I'm the king of Babylon. We're the biggest, most powerful nation on the earth. What I say goes. I have authority. I have control. And Daniel's saying to him here in this thing that God is going to teach you, and he's going to teach you the hard way, that he has authority and he has control, not you. And you are obviously not Nebuchadnezzar, right? None of us will ever have that kind of influence in our society. But nevertheless, even though we can't compare ourselves to Nebuchadnezzar, that the lesson he had to learn is still a lesson that we have to learn. Most of us, at least, I know I do, from time to time, because we all have ideas about ourselves and our importance based on our self-image. We love to inflate ourselves a little bit, get the old head swelled up there about how I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and me, right? And sometimes God has to remind us of who we actually are, especially in relationship to him. And so This is what God's doing with Nebuchadnezzar, and I think this is my opinion. And again, you might have a different an idea here when we get to discussion time, but I think this is why God uses this image of a tree when he gives Nebuchadnezzar this dream, because the tree is the source of all of this blessing, and it fits with Nebuchadnezzar's image of himself. Let's go back and reread verses 20 through 22. Now imagine Nebuchadnezzar seeing himself in this. I think it's easy to see. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to the heaven, and it was visible to the end of the earth, whose leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and in which was found food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of the heavens lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. Now, again, that's not a completely accurate description of Nebuchadnezzar. He wasn't all that. But in the dream, he is that. You see what I'm saying here? And this is Daniel saying, this is what you saw, and this is what it represents. This is your image of yourself. And we know, the one thing we know about Nebuchadnezzar is that he had a pretty inflated sense of his own self-worth. And again, just like we saw with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace, you remember the threat he made to them back in chapter 3, in the end of verse 15. He says to them, if you do not worship, what? The statue that he had set up, right? You shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Now watch the next thing. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? In other words, he's putting himself above any of the gods out there, and he was a guy who believed in many gods. And so you see this arrogance. And I think that's why in this dream in chapter 4, God purposely gives this image of a tree, because that fit with Nebuchadnezzar's idea of himself. He saw himself as the king of everything. He was the one who provided for those under him. Again, if you go back to verses 11 and 12, it says, the tree grew and became strong. Its top reached to the heaven. It was visible to the end of the whole earth. Now, that wasn't literally true based on the old world as we know it, but the world of Nebuchadnezzar's day. Babylon was everywhere, right? Leaves were beautiful, fruit abundant, it was food for all. Beasts of the field found shade under it, the birds of the heaven lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. So that's who Nebuchadnezzar thinks he is. And it's almost true, physically, humanly, but he's got some lessons to learn about humility. I was thinking about this view that Nebuchadnezzar has of himself as he's the center of everything. I've built this empire, and we'll get into that in the next story as well. But I've done all this. I'm the one in charge. And I thought that's actually a great illustration of what sin actually is. So I grew up in, like many of you did, maybe not all, but many of you, in churches where I developed the idea just from hearing sermons and testimonies that sin is a list of bad behaviors, right? Don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. That's sin, right? And as long as you didn't do those things, you're doing pretty good. You know? But over time, I've changed my mind. I've changed my definition of sin. Not that I'm endorsing bad behaviors, I'm not. But I think at its core, sin is really about having a selfish mindset where we make ourselves the center of our universe rather than God. You cannot do all those bad things and still go to hell. That's not the definition of sin in its entirety. Sin is really here and here. That's where it begins. And so this idea of I'm at the center of my world and everything needs to go in the way that I want it to go, I think that's where we really struggle. Maybe I don't, get drunk and beat my wife and rob banks. That doesn't make me a good person, right? I can be lost, my thoughts and my feelings. And we all do this to a certain degree. We all have that selfishness that rises up inside of us. And it's just that Nebuchadnezzar did it on a much larger scale than we're able to. And so because he was so self-absorbed, he had to be reminded of the thing that I need to be reminded of periodically. Verse 25, the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. I want to be in charge of my life. And sometimes I've got to be reminded, Gary, you're not the one in charge. And so Nebuchadnezzar refused to humble himself, and he was going to be reduced to living like an animal. That's the beginning of verse 5. You shall be driven from among men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox. Now, I'm going to tell you a story now. And I didn't put it in your notes because it's not something that I could easily write out. This is a true story. There's somebody, and I'm being a little bit vague, but you don't know this person. He doesn't live here. None of you have met him. I'm sure of that. But it's a man up near where my parents have lived, or had lived for the past 20 years or so, up in the Minnesota area. He was a pretty successful man, and he had built a thriving business, and he'd made a lot of money over the years. And so he and his wife decided to retire. And so they moved to Arizona. They moved to Arizona and built their dream home. I mean, they built it big and beautiful with every conceivable luxury that they had ever wanted. This is where we're going to spend the rest of our lives. And I guess it was an amazing, like a mansion. And I had met him personally years ago, and I know people that had worked with him. And they all confirmed what I kind of felt about him when I first got to meet him and talked to him a few times. He was a very confident person. Like some people just have that, they just have that they're in control, they're in charge. And truthfully, he pretty much would tell you when you get talking. He always talked the same stuff about himself and what he had done. And he would talk about his businesses that he had built up, and he would talk about it. He had done it through hard work and paying attention to the details. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. I'm not diminishing that in the least. And he was a Christian, which is how I met him. I met him in church. He and his wife would go to church every Sunday, and they were good people, moral people, followed the rules of good behavior. You wouldn't have caught them, doing something, bad. And so to outward appearances, everything was great. And people that knew him said, he was polite and nice. And people would have said, this guy's been living a blessed life. But there was one thing that I was kind of like when I would listen to him talk, and then other people said, yeah, he's this way. He was in church every Sunday. He was a decent moral guy. But the one thing he never did was ask God to guide him in anything. He made his decisions based on what he thought. And he had this little way of explaining himself. He would say, God gave me a good mind. So he didn't deny that God, it began with God. But he would say, God gave me a good mind. God made me smart when it came to business and investments and management. And he says, so I don't really need to pray about my decisions because I already know what to do. And by the time I met him, he was in his 60s, and then he retired just a couple years ago. And for most of his life, if you'd have looked at his circumstances, you would have been tempted to think he was right, because everything had gone well for him. Everything he had planned had worked out kind of as he had expected it. A few bumps and glitches on the way, but for the most part, everything he had done had worked out exactly as he thought it would. And he was very smart, and he was very hardworking. And so him and his wife, and she was a really capable person herself. They were both, for their age, they looked young, they were strong, ate right, exercised, all this stuff, looked 15, 20 years younger than they really were. They moved down to Arizona, and they got into this beautiful, beautiful house, and they'd been there 2 or 3 weeks. I forget the exact number, the exact timing. And suddenly his wife, again, she's never been sick in her life, she suddenly gets sick. And within less than a week, she's gone. She died without any warning. Just like, I forget what it was, some kind of disease, and nobody knew that it was coming, and she's dead. And essentially what happened, and I haven't seen him in these years, but people who have been around him were telling me the story when I was up in Minnesota visiting my parents. This man's plans for his future had just fallen apart. And his problem was that he had always been in control. He had always achieved the goals that he had set. And his plan for retirement, the thing that they had never done, him and his wife, they always wanted to do, they planned to travel. Before he retired, he was so busy, didn't have time to travel. Now they had all this money, many, many millions and millions of dollars. And they had their itinerary for traveling planned out for the next 3 years. They were going to get settled into their house, get it all the way they wanted, and then they were going to take off. And for 3 years, they were going to travel the globe. And they had everything they needed, all the money, the passports, whatever, right? And I've heard by people that have been up to see him that essentially now he just sits in this huge house all alone, and his family tries to visit him now and then, and all he talks about is the things that he won't be doing, because everything involved his wife. He doesn't want to travel by himself, and he just sits there and looks at these walls of this. It's a huge house, and that's because there wasn't any room in his plans for things not working out the way he had envisioned them. I'm not picking on this guy particularly. We all have this kind of thing in our life in different ways, right? My point is, this is the kind of thing, whether you're a multimillionaire like this man or whether you're just a regular Joe or somewhere in between or whatever, we need to pay attention to this, because all of us are going to face those hard moments in life where things go very, very wrong. Unexpected things will blindside you, right? And the question you have to ask in that moment is simply this: do I still trust God even when my plans don't work out? That's what this guy had never dealt with. He's probably 67 by now. And for most of his life, nothing ever didn't go the way he planned it. And suddenly something so overwhelming came that just devastated him, and he still hasn't recovered. And I'm trusting he'll get through it, because he is a Christian, he does love God, but he has to change his mentality. The truth is, I don't want to end up like him. The millions and millions of dollars part is not a problem. I won't be there. But the whole thing of I've got my idea, I've got my plan, this is what I'm going to do. I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to end up like Nebuchadnezzar. Look what I've done. Look what I've established. I want to come to the Lord in humility. I want to ask him that he would do his will in my life, and that no matter what happens, every day, I want him to remind me that he's the one in control. And based on that little story I told, some of you are not surprised that I'm going to bring out some of my two favorite verses that I love to read. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. This is Gary preaching to Gary. God preaching to Gary, okay? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. And so just as we wrap it up, that I read that, but I still forget it. Right? And so sometimes God has to let something happen to chop down my tree a little bit, right? Hopefully not as bad as Nebuchadnezzar's tree had to be chopped down. But sometimes God's got to do some pruning on me, right? Because that's the only way that I'll come back to the realization that life isn't about me, it's about him. And to me, that's the great lesson, or one of the great lessons of this particular passage. Life isn't about me. Life is about God, what he wants, and his way is always best. And if I've got any wisdom at all from the Holy Spirit, it should lead me to recognizing that, admitting it, and saying, Lord, you're free at any time to change my plans, because my life is in your hands.